Special thanks to Rockler for sponsoring this video series. I've linked all the tools I used to build this workbench in the description below. One of the most personal projects in any woodworker's career is their first legit workbench, and this is a story of mine. The journey started in the selection of perfect lumber, so I trekked out to Grafton, Illinois to check out a hardwood dealer that's been here for a long time. Ironically, the perfect pieces for the workbench I had in mind were some giant red oak beams, and if you followed me for any length of time, you'll know my scorn for red oak, but I have a plan for these beams. The beams I found measured in at over 16 feet long and were 6 by 6 rough. They'd been air drying for a couple years and showed little signs of rot. Since they were porous red oak, they only weighed about 60 pounds each, but if these were white oak, these could have easily weighed 200 pounds. I cut them down to very rough lengths for the legs and aprons for the workbench and got to work looking for a slab I could use for the top. Where was Matt Cremona when I needed him? The dealer pointed me to a 4-inch thick white oak slab that had been drying for a couple years he just pulled out of storage. Since it had some rot at the edges, he sold it to me for just about $100. But at around 400 pounds, I had to at least rip it in half before I could bring it home and do anything with it. I have to admit, working outside on the banks of the Mississippi River in the sunlight with my wifey running the camera was an awesome change of pace from working in my shop at night at home. With wedges, ingenuity, and just a little bit of sweat and labor, we managed to get the slab ripped in half, and now it was just a matter of getting it loaded in the car and safely brought home. Easier said than done. Since the slabs and beams had been outside for a couple months, I brought them into my shop to acclimate for at least a few weeks before taking my first pass at milling. With wood this thick, it's better to work slowly if you're shooting for anything resembling square in your finished piece. I mean, if this piece wants to move, it's gonna move. Once the wood was reasonably acclimated, it was time for the laborious task of getting these pieces square and workable. Typically working with kiln-dried 4/4 or 8/4 stock, I do all my milling in one day, but taking off material from these old timbers was surely going to release a ton of tension in the wood. So I did my milling over the course of about 2 weeks. I took my first passes down to rough dimensions and let the wood reacclimate and release tension. Then after about a week, I took them down to their critical dimensions and squared them off at the table saw. Because of the long air drying process of these timbers, they were fairly stable, but they had warped quite a bit under their own weight over the course of time. So I was careful to use the flattest surface I could to create reference faces. Not only did I take my time milling these pieces to get more usable stock, but lifting these pieces and carrying them around over and over and over again was exhausting. Some days it was just hard to even get started with these. I'm really glad I upgraded my planer and joiner to the new Laguna models with carbide heads prior to this, otherwise removing all this material would have absolutely buried my shop in wood chips. After all the faces were squared up, I ran them through the table saw really close to their final dimensions and gave them a final pass through the planer to remove any saw marks and get all the pieces to the exact final dimensions. Be super careful if you're ever using your table saw with the blade fully extended like this. I took several shallow passes to get through to the full depth. Wood this thick can hold a lot of tension and cause dangerous kickback or binding of the blade if you're not careful. With all the reference faces now square and smooth, and with the wood now fully acclimated to my shop, I cut the legs to their final length. To cut through the 5-inch thick pieces, I rotated the wood while referencing against the fence to average out any potential error there could be in the cut. I would still then have to go through and correct to make sure they're completely square, since these were used for joinery later in the build. With all the ends squared off, I can now cut all the pieces to their final dimensions. This is part 1 of what's going to be a 3 or 4 part detailed build of this workbench. So if you aren't subscribed, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell so you'll know when part 2 comes out. At the end of this build series, I'll have free build plans with the timber framing build of this bench, as well as a simpler version using construction grade 2x6 pine. So be sure to stay tuned. Next video should have out real soon. It may seem like a long drawn out process for really just getting through step 1 of a build like this, but trust me, rushing through the milling of timbers of this size will lead to nightmares later in the build, so bear with me. If you're tracking, it's now been a month since we went to our hardwood dealer, and we're finally ready for some joinery. I would normally cut tenons by hand, but with timbers this big, there was no room for error. Rockler was kind enough to send me over this heavy-duty cast iron tenoning jig, and with a little setup, this thing worked like a champ. My 5x5 stock was a little too big for the clamps, but the jig still cut perfect tenons. I'll link to this jig in the description. This is again why it was crucial to have the ends dead square, so even with all that fussing at the table saw, I still needed to tune the ends up just a little bit with a block plane before cutting the rouleau tenons. For most tenons, you would cut the mortises first, but for rouleau joints, I cut the tenons first. You'll see why later. I cut one inside cheek of the double tenon first, then flipped the leg around the tenoning jig to ensure the double tenon was dead centered on the leg. And after both cheeks were cut, I removed the bulk of the waste at the drill press. Even with all the power tools in the world, a hand tool is still sometimes the best tool for a job. I carefully marked the baseline of the tenon with a knife edge, then slowly removed material out of the double tenon until I had a flat, if not a little undercut baseline. I removed material from both sides to ensure I didn't blow out either end with the chisel, and I checked for square as I went. I think this is as far as I'm going to get in part 1 of this video, and part 2 will mark out and cut the joinery of this beast and get the whole base assembly glued together, or die trying. Be sure you subscribe to the channel with channel alerts turned on so you'll know when that next video comes out. I normally try and release at least 1 build video a month, but there will probably be 3 or 4 over the next couple weeks finishing up this workbench, so stay tuned. You can also check out Wood.Work.LIFE.com for build plans for this build and also some other builds in the past, and I'll be putting the free plans for this workbench on Wood.Work.LIFE.com once it's finished. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments. And remember to keep your tools sharp and to keep your mind sharper.